Okay, good morning. My name is Dorian Fougeres, currently working with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. First, I want to thank Robert and also Carol Coombs for the invitation to join the Tulare Basin Watershed Partnership Network today and give you a short presentation about integrated landscape restoration at Lake Tahoe. Very brief background about myself. I spent around 10 years or so working for the Center for Collaborative Policy as a facilitator and mediator like Robert, including some work in the Southern Sierra region, including the Integrated Regional Water Management Group, and then quite a bit of work with the Sierra and other national forests in the area. You'll hear a little bit about some of that work in the presentation. And just briefly, I'll say this is an adaptation of a longer webinar I gave for IUCN late last year. I'm going to cram in about 2/3 of the content at about half the time. So it'll be pretty high level, pretty brief, but we'll have time for questions at the end. So let me start sharing my screen and you can see what we're going to cover today. So there we go with the first, just the background slide. Again, the cover title and a bit of background about who I am. The presentation outline, I'm going to talk very briefly about Lake Tahoe since this is a California audience and I think you're probably roughly familiar with the area. Then I'll go into the Lake Tahoe West Restoration Partnership, which probably is the piece that's most of interest. And I'll also talk a little bit about the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative. And then my colleague, Erin Ernst, will talk quite a bit more about that in her presentation. And I'll end with a couple slides about how do we manage these processes or think about transformative change within institutions. So briefly about Lake Tahoe, I think people may know it's the largest alpine lake in North America, about 1,600 feet deep, and it's famous for its blue clarity, which unfortunately has been in decline for decades, but that's another story. What I wanted to point out here on the next slide is that the basin straddles California and Nevada, and there are about 200,000 acres of land in the Lake Tahoe Basin. About 75% of that is owned and managed by the U.S. Forest Service, about 8% by the state of California, 13% by the state of Nevada, and about 4% is private and municipal. So a very high proportion of public land ownership in the Tahoe Basin. Key context for our discussion today, what drove some of this work. In 2007, the Angora fire on the South Shore burned about 3,000 acres, but caused $140 million in damages due to some of the expensive property in the area and some of the dense development in that part of the basin. Then the 2014 King Fire approached the basin, got everyone very nervous. Very luckily, it did not come into the basin. But those two events really drove a desire to replicate what we've been seeing nationally now for 15, 20 years in terms of integrated landscape planning in a variety of different federal agencies and also state and local agencies and partners. Good example of this, 2010, the Federal Forest Service set up the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, really kickstarted a lot of things in California for forest management. On the right-hand side, you can see 8 years later how many of these large landscape, large-scale collaboratives there are for managing forests. When we go ahead then to think about Lake Tahoe, what we really wanted to do here, it's called Restoration Partnership. We really were focused on restoring not the historical conditions, but restoring the resilience of the landscape. And that really means restoring the processes that shape and maintain the landscape. Throughout the Sierra Nevada, that key process is fire. Fire is the disturbance that has helped these forests evolve. So what we are looking at, our working definition of resilience was the capacity to withstand a disturbance like fire while maintaining the structure, function, and identity of that system. And that also does involve learning and adapting. Adaptation is a part of the concept of resilience. There were 5 public agencies, including the agency where I ended up working, the California Tahoe Conservancy, plus the National Forest Foundation, a nonprofit partner that convened the process. We had the agencies, we had a whole dedicated science team, and then we had 2 stakeholder committees. The underlying process design came from what we've called the Forest Landscape Management Cycle. You may have seen this in the Governor's Forest Management Task Force report and recommendations. The idea here is that you're through through working at the landscape scale and that large scale, you are creating efficiencies in planning, in funding, and in operations. And that lets you develop this pipeline of projects that can guarantee you 10 years of work or 20 years of work, which is a critical component, not only for getting a handle on forest management and using every year to the best of our abilities, but also if we think about some of these restoration byproducts and how to have a supply of small scale diameter trees or biomass, whatever it might be for some of our industrial purposes. So briefly, you can see the 7 steps or 7 steps to heaven, if you want a little bit of a joke, beginning with a landscape assessment, then moving through a strategy that covers all the social and ecological values in that landscape. Then you go down to the classic traditional project planning at a smaller scale, the permitting, the implementation, the utilization of those byproducts, and then beginning that cycle again with the monitoring and adaptive management. Around the outside, you can see, of course, the funding, the personnel, these different types of capacity, and the center, the technology, the partnerships, and the organizational learning that goes on throughout this kind of a process. And overall, if you step back, the underlying concept or principle for this work is the systems approach. You're starting with this idea of complex adaptive systems that have both social and ecological components. So these are complex systems, they're nonlinear, they're dynamic, they have emergent properties, and they're self-organizing. A fundamental idea here, again, to really emphasize, you cannot separate people and nature. That's particularly true in the Lake Tahoe Basin, but I would suggest over pretty much anywhere in California, except some very remote places. So in these areas, we were taking, again, this landscape approach. We're looking at forests plus watersheds plus communities together. We're looking across all jurisdictions. You can see on the left-hand side here, the federal, the state, the local government as well, and then aiming for those efficiencies in planning and funding and operations. And then moving on here, another key aspect of the process design is the whole piece around scale. What we really have been pushing is to move from the project to the landscape scale. So typical projects might be 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 acres of forest treatment. What we really wanted to do here was plan for that whole landscape. In this case, the entire west shore of Lake Tahoe, from Emerald Bay up to Tahoe City, about 60,000 acres. Really a key piece why we're doing this is to match the scale of forest management to the scale of those ecological processes, again, in this case, fire, that really shape that landscape. Otherwise, we just get outpaced by the rate of change that we're seeing, particularly with climate change, but even so without that. It might take you 60 or 100 years to restore what otherwise might be a fire regime that covers that landscape in every 20 years. So the next piece that we moved on, this was step 1 in that cycle I showed you, was our landscape resilience assessment covering that entire 60,000 acres. I certainly do not expect you to be able to read any of this text here, but what I wanted to point out were the 3 fundamental components of the assessment. Across the top here, you have to answer the question, resilience of what? What do you want to be resilient? So we had here uplands, meadows, aquatic species, but also don't forget those social aspects as well, public health and safety, cultural landscapes, recreation, these other values that are present on that landscape as well. And then on the left-hand column, those blue boxes, you can see, well, what do you want this landscape to be resilient to? What are the disturbances that are shaping that landscape? Again, a primary one being fire, as well as corresponding smoke, but also we are looking at flood events, drought, insects and disease, other climate impacts, erosion, air pollution, and human activity itself. And then a critical component, which sometimes gets overlooked, but really definitely should not be overlooked, is the question of for whom should this landscape be resilient? So resilience of what to what for whom. In this case, we have the residents that live in the Lake Tahoe Basin, we have the businesses, we have the Washoe tribe, and we have about 24 million annual visitors, depending on your statistics. There's a range of numbers out there. That's more visitors than any national park for those that are count. 3 objects, I can see, got it, recording in progress, I see. And then We would then aggregate them up to kind of look at these different relationships in the landscape. There were several million of these little eco objects on the 60,000 acre landscape. What we then did was look at some absolute indicators. Other indicators were proportional. It's a little bit technical wonkish here, but you can see basically we had a whole series of indicators that we were looking at when we were assessing resilience. And then the key piece that comes together, you'll see it a bit more later, but we're then to put it together. Okay, you have all these little piecemeal pieces, but what does that really tell you about resilience to fire, resilience to flooding, resilience to drought? So you'd have several indicators, 3, 4, 5 sometimes, that would kind of give you a composite score about resilience to one of your primary disturbances. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing, because this next slide will probably intimidate you if that last slide did. But there's, again, I'm not expecting you to read these slides. It's more to give you a sense of what we did. We moved from the assessment to that step number 2, the landscape resilience strategy. And there was a variety of modeling that we were putting together. Some of that was landscape scale and long-term modeling over 100 years, looking at fire and insects and, of course, the vegetation. But we were coupling that with a couple of different pieces of information for other smaller scale values we really want to dig into, like water quality, for example. So there was a lot of modeling that went on here. We did some work developing modeling scenarios. Some of them involved just suppressing fire. Other ones had a lot of prescribed fire, kind of a range of different scenarios, then modeling them and calibrating the models to give us some better sense of what would occur.
Dorian,
we then had a series.
You're about halfway.
Perfect. Thank you, Robert. We then had a series of modeling outputs here. Let me just mark that. We had a series of modeling outputs here. Some were vegetation-based, some were fire-based, some were emissions, if you think about air quality and particulates. Others were wildlife, property. We tried to really put together and get a better sense of what the different management strategies could yield. Moving on, you might have be wondering, okay, well, what does a landscape restoration or resilience strategy consist of? And so this is the fundamental components. It gives you that framework. It gives you goals, strategies, and quantified objectives. I'll give you an example in a moment. And then it also, for the practitioners in the field, whether you're an agency or a farmer or whatever it might be, gives you also the management approaches to really help to implement this and a series of tools. So in this case, just to give you a sense of it, these were the 6 cardinal goals for restoring the landscape. And on the right-hand side, just an example of how, because you have that data-intensive relationship to do the assessment and then to go through the modeling, you were really able to get a pretty fine-grained, good representation of what you would be expecting in terms of the benefits of the strategy when fully implemented. Those goals do extend out over a much longer term. It's not just 20 years, it's really 50 to 100 years, what you're looking for. So again, it's pointing you in the directions that you want to go. The next slide, let me just see. So this is a little bit, nothing again to talk you through, but to talk about the key implementation strategies, and then you would actually pair them and get cost estimates of where you're going to work on the landscape, what the primary and secondary objectives would be. And then when you look at the fully implemented strategy, okay, what are you trying to get when this is all said and done? It's about 20 years of work. Again, that's actually a good thing in many cases for federal agencies in terms of how their periods run, but also this was what you would be looking at by the end of the century, which is where a lot of climate projections go. So briefly to start turning over, I'll just mention a little bit about the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative. It started actually in the same year and wasn't so much Lake Tahoe West. We borrowed a lot from Lake Tahoe West in terms of the conceptual framework and some of the resilience approaches, but it was also building across other work that had gone on in California. So borrowed from Lake Tahoe, but certainly not limited to that. And what we're trying to do here is go from the project to the landscape to the region. So we have about 2.4 million acres in this area. And a key piece here, I'll just flag this. I think it was the original person who spoke, I think it was Terry, mentioned briefly a couple of comments. No, sorry, Matt Hurley. You know, this question, what can we do together that we can't do individually? That is a key question for you guys thinking about what do you want to do with your partnership? Is it just a network and information sharing? Are you trying to actually do planning? Are you trying to put the upper and lower and watershed together that you couldn't otherwise do just as an individual agency or business or whatever it might be. So here were the four, I think there are actually five that we were looking at in Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative. We were trying to really do large scale prescribed fire as that key restoration tool. We were also trying to let natural ignitions burn, particularly in wilderness areas wildernesses they burn as it is, but also in managed areas where there's no human safety concerns across forests. We also have to look at the wildlife component. This has been a huge issue for regulations and management with the California spotted owl. So really trying to get to the scale of subpopulations. Again, that's one of those ecological processes we were looking at that you can't do just in 60,000 acres. Number four was a critical piece. What's that timber supply? If you're looking at restoration byproducts, how do you really get certainty as a business if you're going to be investing in infrastructure for 10 years or more? And then we were also trying to do some of these, looking at the recreation component with some of these very long trails that go across multiple national forests. So a whole series of partners, you've probably know many of these. Within that, there were 8 smaller collaboratives that were pre-existing. You can see here the Lake Tahoe component was one of them, and then there were several others. And then this is pretty much, I think, somewhere where Erin will pick up. They, in January, I think it was January, maybe it was February or March, I lose track of time quickly, but put out a framework for resilience that really was stakeholder driven and agency driven in particular, and putting together what do these kind of concepts look like within that 2.4 million acre, in this case borrowing a lot but also refreshing a lot from the Lake Tahoe West work. You can see again a systems approach. You have air quality, water security. It's not just trees, of course, it's really the watershed and the forests. And then also a similar approach, you would have these different components. Okay, how do you actually measure that? What does resilience look like if you're going to measure something? And giving a bit of flexibility so not everybody has to do exactly the same thing. You might be data rich or data poor, but you can still be comparing and looking across landscapes. I'll let Erin talk a bit more about what they completed with their landscape resilience assessment. It was a similar approach. You have some individual indicators, and then you also have composite indicators, fire resilience, water security, communities, and forest resilience as well. And this is, I think, is still ongoing is doing some of the equivalent of a strategy or a blueprint. It's a little bit different how they approach their assessment and the time frame, looking at current and future conditions. But in this case, they are working with some decision support tools to inform that management approach. And some of the options might include trying to replicate some of this approach across the state. That was something that the Sierra Nevada Conservancy was considering for a period, and also the Governor's Forest Management Task Force. Just to wrap up here, because I'm worried about going too far over on time, I'm going to totally switch gears and just talk for a moment about, I should have given you the title there. So transformative change within institutions, what I was talking about at the very beginning. So, when I just reflected a little bit on why is this hard to do, here's kind of the punch list of things. There's a lot of complexity. It took a lot of time to really sort through what are these different values, who needs to be involved at the table, what data do we have, how do we actually do the analyses, what about the modeling, what about the different regulatory components, what about NEPA and CEQA. There's so much complexity when you try and move just from managing for trees or managing for wildlife to all the other values on the landscape. In your case, I'm sure that pops out fairly quickly. Also, it's a bit of a challenge for some staff that aren't particularly trained or prepared to do this kind of work. That's not a criticism. They have degrees, they have careers, and they have not been necessarily trained to think in terms of systems or work in terms of systems. And they do fantastic work. It's just that if you want to shift then and suddenly do more integrative work, or you want to have some kind of stakeholder engagement, there's a retraining component, and there's often not time or resources to do that, which ends up kind of feeding into or building upon number 3. It's just straight up more work. Running a collaborative process usually occurs when there's some kind of conflict that has been blocking things otherwise. So there's a very high incentive to work together. In the absence of that, if it's just, altruistic, so to speak, it's a lot more work. And I'll come back to this in a moment on what some of the options are, but it's a lot more work. Also, of course, there's uncertainty with relation to risk tolerance. If you have any attorneys in your organizations or your agencies, you will understand that if you're going to pioneer some approach, you get corresponding uncertainties and risks with that. Again, number 5 is a little bit redundant, but if you're working well in the current approach you have and you feel like you're functioning well, you don't necessarily get a benefit or a clear efficiency from working together. It's the more work component. And then at the individual level, oftentimes there are weak or non-existent incentives, whether it's training, whether it's recognition, whether it's a salary increase or some kind of bonus. There's not a lot of reason to deal with this complexity, work across agencies, train yourself, read more, work more. It's an uphill battle. But here on a bit of a brighter side, one thing that we used to talk a lot about at the Center for Collaborative Policy was how do you change how do you alter the calculation of the change equation? So typically on the top here, what you see currently, the cost of change is more expensive than the cost of doing business as usual. All those 5 reasons I just gave, that means the cost of change is quite high. What can you do to flip it so that the cost of staying the same, all the things that maybe aren't working or aren't going so well or are creating conflict or are losing money or whatever it is, how do you make those business as usual characteristics become more apparent to people when you think about in contrast to a different way of doing business? In this case, perhaps this integrated landscape approach that you guys are looking at with upper and lower watershed across sectors and industries. So a couple of those approaches you might have to it. You can flip some of those barriers that I mentioned earlier on the previous page. You can think about support for training or acknowledgement of staff, but and these last 3 are probably critical. One thing I would say is if you're going to have public agencies involved, make sure you get that executive sponsorship, because if there's resentment on the part of staff, it's going to be that executive that says, this is what our organization is doing. This is why we're going to invest more time and resources. Sorry if that's not what you came here to work for, but it's an institutional change piece we're working on. So ensuring executive sponsorship, I'm wrapping up here. I know I'm at the 20 minutes there. Third piece, I would really recommend establishing a lead scientist. The CalFed program, I know that can, in some parts of the state, will burn in effigy, but the CalFed program, and actually quite others, a lot of organizations do this, have a lead scientist. So somebody that is fluent and aware of kind of these approaches, is familiar with it, is comfortable with it, and can provide some of that leadership to extremely well-qualified scientists, but maybe people who haven't done this kind of work before. So I would really consider establishing a lead scientist for the work. And then when you have those components around risk or conflict, it's number 4 here. So having some kind of mediated stakeholder process. That's what I used to do with Carol and Steve and Sarah and others in the past in the Southern Sierra. And to end with, this is what I added just shortly, Robert, what I sent to you after the call. If you're thinking about that and you're interested in thinking more about stakeholder processes, I would recommend both of these books. I think most people have heard of Getting to Yes on the left-hand side and those principles of interest-based negotiation. Don't forget also the right-hand side, negotiating with emotions, the types of things that people want that are not necessarily linear left brain logical needs, but are critically important to having a collaborative process work. Things like being affiliated with a group and having a meaningful role and other components there. I won't talk through them all. Let me stop there, Robert. I think I'm probably close on time and I'm a little reticent. I can easily speak way over, so I'll stop there.
That's great, Dorian. Thank you so much. That's great. I mean, what I appreciate you're doing is not just talking about the ecological elements and the technical elements, but also those organizational, cultural, financial, all those other issues that can really get in the way of success. And acknowledging clear-eyed that it's not always easy work. It's, maybe aspirational and inspiring, and clearly there's can be a very deep meaning, kind of sense of meaningfulness in the work, but it's not easy, right? So it's just being, clear about that, and then also acknowledging there's ways to make those changes so that we can do good work together. So thanks so much, Dorian. I appreciate it. We are tight on time. If anyone's got a sort of we have time for just one urgent burning question, and then we might be able to save a little bit once Erin's done, maybe for a joint Q&A there. Anything that pops up for people that they would want to ask Dorian now live while he's on the call? while we're tight on time, don't be shy. If you've got something. Okay, here's a question that came up. What was the determining factor for which tribes to work with?
We worked with the Native American Heritage Commission, which some people probably know maintains a list of all California Native American tribes, and that includes federally recognized tribes. And so as a state agency, we were required to make sure that we provide notice to all the tribes. And so there was an option and an invitation to participate. I think there were about 6 that either six that had some form of ties to the Lake Tahoe Basin and 1 that chose to participate.
Okay.
But the Native American Heritage Commission list was the functional tool and process we used.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I think in the interest of time, I bet if we really kind of spend a little time here and kind of unpack this, we could probably have a 2-hour-long conversation. But Erin, I'd love to just hand it over to you to talk more specifically about the Tcsi, Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, and kind of what you're doing currently, some of the things that are working, some of the lessons learned, that kind of stuff. So welcome, and we're so glad to have you.
Thanks, Robert. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. All right, as Robert said, I'll be presenting on the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative. My name is Erin Ernst, and I work for the state agency, the California Tahoe Conservancy. I've worked for the agency for just under 2.5 years, and I've been the TCSI coordinator for just over 1.5 years. So a quick outline.
Erin, sorry to interrupt you right out of the gate, but I just wanted to just check, are others able to see Erin's full screen? Yes? Okay, great. It's just on my screen then. Okay, great, sorry. Go ahead.
Thanks, Robert. So quick outline, I'll give some background information on TCSI to kind of complement stuff Dorian mentioned. And then as Robert mentioned, he asked me to talk a bit more about some of our current work around opportunity mapping and some of the science efforts there. Work we're doing that how it aligns with state and regional prior efforts, and also some of the lessons learned that I'll be speaking of I've seen along my last 1.5 years in the position. So background, TCSI was formed out of a sense of urgency that was felt by partners in 2016 and 2017 from issues such as the bark beetle mortality in the Southern Sierras, wildfires that were increasing in size and intensity, and concerns that were not many opportunities for biomass utilization in the region. A lot of restoration work has and continues to occur in this landscape. However, TCSI itself does not necessarily implement projects. Partners recognize that project level collaborations couldn't solve certain challenges we were grappling with. We needed to approach the challenges from a landscape scale, roughly 1 to 3 million acres, as many scientists believe that this is a scale where we can restore resilience in a meaningful way because it really impacts some of the processes that you look for at a landscape level resilience. TCSI is a 2.4 million acre landscape that's defined by several watersheds. TCSI does take a science-based approach to restoration and incubates new ideas by incubates new approaches by investing in new ideas, tools, and technologies that address landscape scale issues, such as some of the, Dorian already mentioned some, but increasing pace and scale of restoration projects, supporting market economies, managing wildlife corridors, implementing cross-boundary treatments, as well as the overarching concerns around climate change. The TCSI MOU was signed in August of 2017 by those partner logos you see there on the right-hand side. So science efforts, just real quick here, as I mentioned, one of the cornerstones of TCSI is having a consistent science-based approach. And here are some of the key pieces that build on each other, as you can see. So we first have the framework for resilience that Dorian mentioned briefly, and that defines resilient conditions and desired landscape outcomes and metrics. The resource assessment builds on the framework by using those pillars and identifying current conditions and quantify departure from resilient conditions, as well as modeling for future conditions. And then all that information and data is then combined together further to build the blueprint for restoration tool, and that provides a spatial map of management opportunities. So just to get a bit more specific about these three pieces, first, the framework for resilience. The framework identifies what we want to see in the landscape. It identifies what a resilient landscape looks like. It identifies social and ecological values that make up the landscape. Those values are depicted by the 10 pillars that represent desired outcomes of landscape resilience. And you see those there on the left-hand side. The pillars of resilience are, I feel they have broad applicability across not only the Sierra Nevada, but even wider, especially in fire-adapted ecosystems. Each of the pillars provide metrics for assessing landscape conditions, as Dorian already mentioned. Those pillars and metrics can help groups and users plan, implement, and monitor restoration projects, as well as help you document your progress and contribution towards local, regional, and statewide goals. The framework development started in 2018 with a workshop that brought together land managers and scientists from all over the Sierra Nevada to discuss resilience from a regional perspective. And as Dorian mentioned, the large report was finished in late 2020, and then we had the more glossy document that was released back in March. Following the framework is a resource assessment. The resource assessment tells us what we have and lets us know how far the landscape is or close to from resilience. There are two pieces. The first measures current conditions on the landscape, and this data and information is organized by the pillars, and we see a couple of pieces here from that report around drought vulnerability. The second part models future conditions through 2100 by looking through different management scenarios and climate models to project what our landscape might look like in the future, again, organized by the pillars. Collaboratives within Tcsi are already using both the framework for resilience and resource assessment data for project planning. So next I'm going to get into the blueprint for restoration, and this has the opportunity mapping piece that Robert requested I go into a bit more detail. So this timing is really great. We had a steering committee meeting this past Friday where we looked at some draft results from the blueprint. So I'll be focusing more on those results, not as much on the process, but I definitely welcome questions if you have any on the process. So the blueprint, and kind of keeping with our theme, tells us what can be done in the landscape and builds on the framework and resource assessment, and by developing measurable target conditions for the pillars as well as the metrics that promote resilience. So again, it's using both current and future conditions data. You look at, on a scale, they've taken the data and analyzed it and have it on a scale from +1 to -1, with +1 to 0 being within target, and from 0 to -1 being departed. And you can see there on the right, the graph, it shows that 2 dimensions with both current conditions as of 2019, and then the future conditions as of 2020 to 2040. So I also do want to mention that as we're looking through this, this is definitely the first run that the scientists have done through of this opportunity mapping, and it's still going to be going through a process of review and vetting by the stakeholders. And so they've categorized in kind of 4 different quadrants, and I won't go, it kind of gets very specific, but monitor, protect, adapt, and transform when you look at different areas in the landscape. So what they've done here is you're looking at the scale from high, from 7.5 to 1 down to low. In this case, the red would be the areas you would want to be focused on as having a higher priority to consider treating, because that is where management can have the greatest impact with the highest certainty. So in this case, you wouldn't want to necessarily treat, the scientists' recommendation so far is you wouldn't necessarily treat all the departed areas first, but treat where we have the greatest ability to obtain and maintain target conditions across pillars. So what we see here is 4 different pillars on the bottom with their scores, and then they're combined. At this point, they're all weighted equally to show that combined map. And one really great piece of feedback we got is looking at the fire dynamics pillar at that very top part of the map there. One of our 4 supervisors commented that that was really interesting because those were some areas that were treated prior to 2019, and he was very delighted to see that from the fire dynamics piece, it looks like that their treatments may have had an impact looking at the data we have here. So to go to a bit of a different scale here, this map here on the right is showing a portion of the El Dorado National Forests. And these different color polygons are at a HUC 12 level, and HUC 12 is anywhere from roughly 20,000 to 35,000 acres. And so this is, again, looking at opportunity mapping, looking at where you might want to prioritize how you plan your future projects at this HUC 12 level. Again, the red polygons are ones we would want to probably consider, or the scientists are recommending that we would consider treating first. So, but also to mention that these polygons and this information doesn't say what actions to take. So it's not necessarily telling you what your prescription should be. It's just that these are the areas that you should probably look to analyze and prioritize when you're looking to treat and have planned projects into the future. To get to an even further level, this is one of those HUCs. This is a roughly just under 29,000 acres. And you can see in this area that around 37% of the area is in a, scientists have determined to be in a restoration need, 63% to be in a conservation need. So this even within that HUC 12, you can see a variety of conditions looking at this scale. So while there would be a recommendation to focus on treatment on those areas that are more red, if you do kind of gray those out, what you do see is the areas that are maybe a bit more of a conservation kind of phase. And what the recommendation is there is to possibly think of those as anchors, as points that you want to consider starting from and building out from when you're planning your treatments. So next piece Robert asked me to mention was how TCSI is aligning with state and regional efforts. And you can see I have a whole litany list here of ways that that we are doing that. And also these are very applicable to other collaboratives, not necessarily even have to be in the forested watersheds at the, at the headwaters of the Sierras. So I'll kind of run through these and give some high level comments. Dorian mentioned the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force. Their action plan came out earlier this year. You can see that on the right-hand side. And we've really looked to, we're looking at some of those actions and trying to understand how we can contribute to that. Specifically, there's a call out for the state to treat roughly 1 million acres a year, which is a huge amount. And we've already looked at what TCSI region's part in that would be, and that would be roughly 60,000 acres a year. When you look at where we are now, if you include low and moderate intensity fire, we're roughly around 30,000 acres. So this is something we're considering as we look at how we might ramp up our pace scale of our work and what our goal would be to need to get to. The next piece of how we're trying to align with state efforts is the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program. And you can see that map there in the middle of those different regions. And this has come out of the Department of Conservation, and they're giving these different regions money to help with capacity building and also getting projects to a point where they can be implemented. So we've done a lot of coordination already within TCSI. It kind of already fits that Sierra Nevada Conservancy subregion. And this is another great way that we're, as far as building capacity, especially with working with partners who do work on non-public lands, there's definitely a big need to build capacity there. I'd like to mention the Shared Stewardship Program and also cross-boundary projects. The Shared Stewardship Program started earlier this year. The Forest Service received a grant from CAL FIRE and is working with another federation to hire coordinators. There are 4 or 5 coordinators throughout the regions, and they're working with different zones of the Forest Service forests, as well as other partners in these areas. And they're really looking to understand what projects are in a ready state, ready to be implemented and just need and could use funding, and understand where there's capacity needs. The other thing they're really pushing, which again, I think is applicable across many collaboratives, is really looking at cross-boundary projects. Now, what they mean by that is across both state and federal jurisdiction. They just see a lot of great alignment with that. And I think it's helpful because as the state is looking towards that, I think there's going to be funding opportunities if you can have projects that are cross-boundary. The other piece that we're working on here within TCSI is conservation finance. I believe Robert mentioned you already heard from someone from the Placer County Water Group and some of the funding and work that they're doing on specifically the French Meadows project. There's another project that's similar with conservation finance that involves called the North Yuba Forest partnership, and that involves the Yuba Water Agency. In that case, I believe the agency has provided some funding for that project as they recognize the value in protecting the upper headwaters of their watersheds to help with the downstream and with their supply, and recognize protecting that, especially from high severity fires, in their best. There's a lot of interest in, and people are trying to find creative ways on to fund projects. So I think this is, there's been getting traction here, but I think I'm looking forward to seeing how this particular area continues to kind of blossom and see what else comes up. In a similar vein of shared stewardship, and also the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program is shared resources. TCSI is working on developing an all lands prescribed fire and fuels crew, so that could be utilized across different forests and state lands, and potentially even private lands, to do prescribed fire and fuels work. Long-term contracts, we just found out last week that the Tahoe National Forest, the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit, and the National Forest Foundation have just signed a 20-year master stewardship agreement. That's the first in this National Forest region to happen, which is really great. There's a lot of great value in having long-term contracts. One of the pluses is when you look on the supply side, there's a great, that's very helpful to when you think about infrastructure and contractors or purchasers having some kind of a defined supplier guarantee of work that might be occurring over a long term is really important to the success and for the economics of the region. So that, again, was just signed. But I think, again, that's something that's being encouraged by the state and the region. Finally, I just want to mention that TCSI is working on their own regional action plan, looking across all lands. And in addition to that, so along with the action plan, and then with some of the work that will be coming out of the blueprint that should be finalized later this fall, developing a 10-year program of work. So that's looking out 10 years across the TCSI region, and looking at how we're planning our work, how many acres we're looking to treat. That will also help us as we look to possibly ramp up the number of acres we're treating per year. We see a lot of value in this, in communicating what work we're doing. We also see value in when we're looking for out-year funding, and to make the case for funding that's in longer cycles than just a couple years. There just is a lot more value in building up capacity for projects and for different agencies and organizations to continue to do work as the state is really looking for.
Erin, just a quick time check too. Are you close to your?
Yep, this is my last slide right here.
Great. Thank you.
So real quick on lessons learned, I'll go through these at a real high level. Applying for funding, TCSI has found that they've been most successful applying for funding when we've had a real coordinated effort at a high level. That's when we received, have been very successful, specifically with CAL FIRE CCI funding. The region's received over $32 million in funding for projects and science work. Another lesson learned is capacity. Because TCSI isn't specifically implementing projects, sometimes we've had issues around getting capacity from partners to organizations to do some of the work we've been talking about. I'm the only full-time person on TCSI, working with TCSI. So there's been, that's been something we're trying to solve a bit more. In addition, we've really seen that with some of our science work. There is definitely a gap before I came in of over a year. And so there was not really much time for review and feedback of some of the science products. Last two pieces here are, and they kind of go together, is outreach to stakeholders, tribes, and local jurisdictions. Before I came on board, TCSI was really looking to have a lot of that happen at the local collaborative level, which is really great. But since TCSI has been coming out with more of these products, specifically these science products, we've not done a really great job of outreaching to these different groups to share the information we have and how it can be valuable to them, and to also get feedback from them on other pieces, other work that would be valuable as we're working at the regional scale. So that kind of ties those last two pieces in. So thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions that you might have. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Great, thanks so much, Erin. That's really great. And I'm just going to start off with a quick question, and hopefully others have some thoughts too. The first question, I think, is really just in the kind of domain of it seems like with TCSI that there's a fair amount of kind of agency driven, kind of almost state level drivers, I guess, behind that work, which makes total sense there. I'm also wondering, and it's sort of a longer term, kind of very methodical process, which is really seems needed and really important. The question I have is, to what degree are other groups, NGOs, the smaller collaboratives you mentioned, are they still kind of moving forward with their own projects? It's sort of like almost these things are happening in parallel. So there's still a lot of great work happening while this kind of larger overarching framework is being developed. Could you say a little bit about kind of those parallel tracks? And it could be, this is for Erin or Dorian for that matter.
Sure, I'll take a quick stab at that. So I mentioned it just very briefly when I first started my presentation, is that some of the different processes that we look at when we talk about resilience, especially across the landscape, a lot of scientists have recommended or suggested that those need to be looked at a much larger scale, roughly that 1 to 3 million acre scale. And so that's something that most collaboratives or project groups they're not at that scale. They're roughly like one kind of level down. The biggest in our TCSI is the North Yuba Forest Partnership, is 250,000 acres. So we're really looking at, when you're talking about biomass infrastructure for different economies, or things around climate change or wildlife corridors or large scale prescribed fire, it's helpful to address it at a level higher than the project collaborative scale. Dorian?
Yeah, I'll answer it in a different way, which is, I think the short answer is yes. And I'll just use it as a way to reiterate, I think the importance, I'm not exactly sure where you guys are in your formation process, but is to get clear about what value, what kind of needs do you really see, and what value can you generate through a partnership? Because there are looser affiliations like networks. A good one is the California Landscape Stewardship Network, for example. They're pretty loose. They meet maybe twice a year, and then they have a couple key pieces that they work on with legislation or liaising with the secretary or certain kind of white papers. That's different than a partnership like TCSI, for example, that might be doing a fair bit of planning for, like Erin pointed out, the scale of work they do, no individual group is going to do on itself, or even individual collaborative, which then might be different too from, again, that approach within TCSI, where, to your question, Robert, it was not, okay, let's mastermind and organize 300 individual projects across 2.4 million acres. It was more about supporting these smaller initiatives and letting them do individual planning. So that's a long way of saying, yes, those individual collaboratives continue to work. And then it goes to the question of, what would this group want to do? Do you want to go all the way to where you're directly planning collaborative projects that have the same mission, the same goals? Or are you trying to support each other and kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom, but you have some shared funding, you have some shared vision, you have some shared strategy? Or are you doing something where it's, no, we're mostly information exchange and sharing resources and experiences, which has a great value in itself, but we're not trying to actually plan or produce something together. So no answers, but anyway, just I think an important question. I should probably say the obvious piece, sorry, it was last thought. The obvious piece about that is, there's so often questions, it was even in the initial survey question you posed, Robert, of like, okay, well, everyone get on board. This wasn't what you said, but everyone get on board for large scale, landscape scale collaborative planning. I think that actually it's as great as that is, it's absolutely fundamental that those individual, much smaller scale initiatives continue, because oftentimes it's where you get so much innovation, you get so much place-based knowledge, you just get a tangible impact and effect. I really think it must be both. I think they are important. I think maybe what's been missing historically in some parts of the state of California has been some of that larger stuff, but that shouldn't come at the expense of all these local initiatives continuing. I think I'm preaching to the choir. I'll stop there.
Thank you for those answers. And I'll say that too, that just to explain just very briefly, with the network right now, with the Tulare Basin network, we are envisioning this as a kind of a collaborative innovation effort, so that there's actual on the ground solutions and projects being developed. We already are underway with scoping out one now in the Deer Creek watershed, which is a smaller watershed that's undammed in in our area, just south of the Tule River. So that's kind of just taking shape right now. We're collaborating with others that are already, you know, actively involved in the lower part of the watershed, but again, sort of integrated upper and lower watershed approach. And there's also an effort to kind of support, acknowledge, accelerate the good work that's already happening in the region already. There's already some good things happening. So it's not sort of to replace those at all or to compete with them. It's really to try and amplify and support them where you can, like you said, let the thousand flowers bloom. So let's see, we have time for maybe just one more question. We're a little tight on time here, unfortunately. Here's one that came in, and we'll see if we have time for a second one, maybe even. What do you think, if you're familiar with this, what do you think of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's RCIS program? It's a great platform. What are your thoughts on it? Do you have any, are you guys familiar with that at all? Or is that too much in the lower watershed for your familiarity?
I'm trying to refresh my memory a little bit. I have spent a fair bit of time. I think, well, I got a very nice introduction to it, but haven't worked with it. I do think that they've made exceptional strides in trying to make it friendly for landowners and private as well as public uses of lands. What I mean by that is things like highways, right? I mean, it's not a wilderness area or conservation component, but it's trying to really be integrated. I think they have some exceptional decision support tools. The thing that I don't know enough about is exactly how they think about their kind of conservation areas and to what extent those are, you know, primarily wildlife centric, well, whatever, plant and animal centric, or whether they are also looking at things like, for example, recreation, industry, you know, the other components of the landscape. And I should say, Robert, too, sorry, I'll sneak this one in here because I saw a question from Judy Allen. Hi, Judy. Much earlier, and so it's probably buried in the queue. There was a question about how does something like TCSI fit with the National Forest landscape land management plans. And I'll just say, Erin can probably represent this better than I can. At least in the Lake Tahoe Basin, on that particular component, they had just updated their plan in 2015. So it was actually really nice to try and find some of the consistencies and pull out certain things from that larger, even more comprehensive land management plan that could be emphasized and prioritized through this. So in that sense, they were nicely concurrent, but it was not intended to be a replacement for that forest land management plan that was already established. I'm not sure about the Tahoe and the El Dorado for TCSI.
Okay, all right, great. So any last burning questions from the audience? We want to make sure we have got some time for the breakouts, and you know, there's a lot of expertise and a lot of intelligence in this group, and we want to make sure we kind of capture some of that, tap some of that as before we go. So any questions you want to ask now while we have Erin and Dorian live here? And you can do it via chat or directly. I think we've addressed the questions that were in there. Some good ideas already in the chat as well. Okay, I think we have some shy people here today, for sure, not wanting to kind of speak up directly. So just, and I'm going to put you two both on the spot a little bit. If folks have questions, if we gave them email, is that okay? If you've got, yeah.
Maybe, Robert, what I would ask is, you know, maybe give people 10 days or 2 weeks or something if they do have questions, and maybe if you could just aggregate them, because then I can take see if there are any commonalities or something like that. Maybe I'll get one or two. But anyway, yes, short answer is yes, I'd be happy to respond if there are some questions. And I'm sure once I sign off, then people will be like, all right, let's talk.
Right. Exactly right. Right. And I also want to, so thank you again so much for sharing what you have shared. There's it feels like a sip from a fire hose. There's so much great stuff there. There's a lot that's really available. And I know those materials and resources are also, things that we can access later. So if we want to kind of dive deeply into them, we certainly can, any one of us or collectively. So we also want to acknowledge, I think, some of the local work. I know this is more Tahoe centric in a sense, or Central Sierra centric. And we want to also acknowledge that there's some really great work down in this area that's already been happening, that's sort of either watershed or landscape scale. And we probably won't do justice to all of them. And we don't actually, unfortunately, we don't really have time to talk about them because we're a little behind schedule. We want to acknowledge them and then say, hey, in the future, we're going to be kind of featuring them a little bit more. There is an RCIS effort happening down in this part of the state for the first time. So that's exciting. We'll talk about that actually at our next session on August 4th. There's the Southern Sierra Partnership, and with that, the associated IRWIM that's involved, the Integrated Regional Watershed Management efforts. Jeff, I see you're off mute. Is there anything quickly you want to say about the partnership?
No, just wanted to say that I'm glad I'm off the hook because I'm not the correct person to be speaking of either of those groups. So, but I did put in the chat the links to both the Southern Sierra Partnership and also to the Southern Sierra IRWIM. So fantastic.
Thank you, Jeff.
You can go there.
We also want to just acknowledge and give a quick shout out, and we won't have time to talk about this one either, but there's the Kings River Conservation District and Associated Water Authority effort. That is also a collaborative effort that hopefully in the near future we'll hear from Sua Lee about that. That's already happening. And of course, the newer Tulare, I'm gonna get this right, the Land and Water Conservation Trust, and Rain Akiona is now the new watershed coordinator for that we're going to be collaborating with, and we're calling this Sequoias to Sloughs effort, this project I mentioned earlier. So those are a few other things that are happening in the region as well. Randy, you could just kind of wave and say hello. There we go. All right.
Talk about her response to Barbara Breidoff's concern. It would be valuable for everyone to hear that. Pat, are you
sure
there?
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to be here. I'm with the Pacific Southwest Research Station of the Forest Service and co-science lead for Lake Tahoe West and TCSI science that you heard about today. And the question was, how to build capacity or how to bring capacity, and this modeling and the scientific needs, and particularly because of climate change, can't really, address the needs of these landscapes in a sort of a credible way, I guess is one way to put it, without some of this modeling. And it's really daunting. So I think what we talked about is a little bit about being a convener, that this group you don't have to have the expertise internally. You can bring the expertise to the table by being convener. And the Circle group on the Tahoe National Forest has been wildly successful in doing that. They've raised millions of dollars to bring to that landscape, and then use that funding and that support and that collaboration with the National Forest in that case. But many different agencies, the Yuba Water Agency, as Erin mentioned, to bring funding, expertise, and progress to the landscape assessment and strategy and implementation in that landscape. So I think this idea of having to have it all yourself, you don't have to do that, but you can be really powerful conveners, and that is a great formula for success. So that was it.
Well said. I appreciate the question that probably precipitated that answer, Pat, and I also appreciate the answer both. I think that's a lot of what we're intending, is that we are trying to bring in experts, but not, and where we feel it's necessary to actually build some of that capacity, some of that expertise, or highlight what's already here as well. So thank you for that. That's really great. Other key ideas that rose to the surface?
Steve has his hand up.
Go right ahead, Steve. Yeah. You're on mute right now.
Yeah, not really. We just had enough time to get introduced, and it was kind of interesting that we had the representative from the California Farm Bureau, Justin, involved, and then Richard from the Sierra Club, local chapter of the Sierra Club. Are you able to hear me? I just want to be certain of that.
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Okay. And just from the introductions, it was the opportunity to be able to share what our interests are, and then how to put them on the table, and then see how we can work together. And so the network at this stage is a great opportunity to continue to move that forward on a regional basis. The other part is, Dorian mentioned the CalFed Bay Delta program, and being involved with that, having experience with that, I think that's a real good model, even though it may not be supported through DWR like it was in the past in the State Water Resources Control Board and about 24 other state and federal agencies. But that was an opportunity, and I think as a framework in which to build off of. Now, the reason why I bring that up is that much of the funding went to those doing the work on the ground, like Dorian was talking about, right? The 1,000 flowers. However, we had the full complement of those state and federal agencies like tier 2 support. My feeling is on a regional basis that there's got to be less government in the forefront and more on the supportive side of the house, and allow us to develop a regional approach on a cooperative basis that allows for everybody to be at the table, and then address socioeconomic and environmental challenges, the resiliency aspects associated with it, and water is number one priority to be shared by everyone.
That's great, Steve.
Now,
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I'm going to leave it there. I could go on and on. So
great. So just to summarize, in part, what you're saying is that really for federal and state agencies, the key is to help kind of provide support funding for local on the ground efforts that can really engage local stakeholders, can really foster sort of a ground up kind of initiative, right? Rather than you're not looking for sort of a top down kind of a strategy here.
Absolutely. And they are public servants, and they may be constrained on capacity and actually competing for the same dollars. Uncle Sam needs to do their part of the job. Sacramento has a role to play, but why not localize it and regionalize it, and build from the ground up, like building a house, right? Build the foundation. You go from there.
Great, thank you. Any other comments or insights from your discussion or from the session earlier, the presentations?
Hey, Robert, this is Larry. Just
Please, yeah.
Just interesting to hear that DWR is starting watershed assessments all the way for the San Joaquin, and maybe someone from the agency could let the rest of us know, maybe in some detail, what the regional planning at the watershed levels DWR is starting.
Yeah, there might be someone that's from DWR that could at least. Yes. What, AJ, were you going to respond?
Yes, Robert. This is Ajay Goel from DWR. I manage the DWR flood mark program.
Okay.
And in this program at this time, we are doing a watershed scale analysis of the Merced River watershed. And we're going to be, we just got approved for funding to study another watershed in the San Joaquin Valley, which most likely could be Calaveras. And then we are in the process of requesting, or we have requested funding to study other watersheds in the valley, like Stanislaus, Upper San Joaquin, and then Lower San Joaquin. And then another thing is we will be, right after Merced, starting on Tuolumne River watershed, also working with TID, NSFPUC. So that's where we stand. So in this effort, we will have to put together a network, a watershed network, where we will, similar to this effort that we're talking about today, and coordinate this effort with all various agencies within the watershed. So a lot of learning to do for us from this group.
That's great. Thanks, Jay. That's something that we recently talked about, actually, is the possibility of coordinating efforts, because there are some of our key players in this network are kind of right there at the bottom of the in the valley there, right where the San Joaquin is, so that there may be some natural overlap there. So thank you for sharing that. Much appreciated. And also Pat Manley says that the Forest Service is working towards providing data layers for the landscape analysis. And that will be across all lands in the Sierra Nevada, with the intent of giving groups like this and the Forest Service a leg up in getting needed assessments and strategies developed. Thank you. So there's sort of this federal effort to help kind of share resources there. That's nice, very nice to hear. Let's see, and CNPS, it has a program to map important plant areas, and the org also has a mapping plant communities throughout the state. So they've got also resources for us available too. One thing in terms of resource, I just want to say before we're almost ready to sign off, is that in the chat, we've also included the charter for this network, so you get a better sense of what the network's working on and intending to do. So that's available in the chat right now, a little farther up, around minute 10:17. Any last comments from our design team, or any other just last thoughts before we only have about a minute left before we wrap up? Matt?
Just briefly for me is that, you know, one of the most important parts of being a network is sharing information. Again, this was a great forum. I learned a lot. I was encouraged by the fact that almost everything that the speakers talked about, we have experienced already in this particular effort. Much of our charter is very similar to some of the organizational paperwork that they were able to share with us. So it makes me feel like we're on the right track. And hopefully we'll be able to continue to gather even a larger group on a larger landscape. The Tulare Basin is a lot bigger than 1 to 3 million even, Erin. So, you know, we got a lot of acres out here, and I think we can do a lot of really good things. And I'm looking really forward to the continuation of this. Lots of new faces, new names. I'm excited to see this thing starting to take a little traction.
That's great. Carol?
Also, as a member of the design team, I want to thank all of the people who have joined this meeting, and I hope that you will continue on through the second and third series. We really need all the brains, all your good help and thinking to help carry this through to the third series, which ultimately will come up with integration and some big, bold ideas. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. That's great. So on the screen, you'll see just the next event, the Lower Watershed Resilience through Advanced Water Strategies session. That'll be on August 4th. And we'll have 3 local speakers talking about that. So thank you, everyone. We appreciate you taking the time and staying with us through the discussion, and have a wonderful day.